If I could, before we get underway, I would like to promote things that the Watt Center has for sale. We have the 2024 calendar, $10 a piece. We have this year's calendar, and it is by donation, so keep that in mind. We have John Wilson Laughlin's Civil War memoir. This is a very interesting read. Joel and Shelley, there's 2 more up here. You can come right on up. History of Barnesville. This is the Tanny Hill, which is very early Barnesville history. This is one of my favorites, Barnesville's 200 years. And on the back, I see someone familiar.
Yes, there are 4 of us.
We have Marie, Bruce, me, and Jean Davies. All of us are in the room tonight, I believe. That's pretty
And that's already been...
This lovely one. This is the centennial that we reprinted. It was long out of print, and it is fascinating. Lots of pictures of Barnesville houses and businesses. One of my favorites, it's a picture book, just like this is a really good picture book. And last but not least, The Story of Barnesville, Dr. Shepard's book, larger print, easier to read. So afterwards, we'll have all of these for sale. And now, without further ado, my good friend Bruce Yarnall is going to share 215 plus years of history.
Yes, slightly more than that. But anyway, as a longtime member of the Watt Center, however, from a long distance, a lot of the commercial stuff that's downstairs, I donated back in 1995 or 1996. Every time I come home, somebody's saying, hey, we'll give you this or we'll give you that. And I already have 2.5 boxes to go back with me that I need to sort through. But one of the packages that came to me yesterday following church was this box, which is a suit box, which is Foster's store, which was on West Main Street. And it's probably late 1930s looking at so anyway, that one's staying in Barnesville because it's fragile enough, but I had to get the weight out of it. So if you have stuff that you would like to donate, by all means, Eric Sidwell or anyone else here at the Watt Center. So I'm going to try to carry through this history, and I'll try not to bore you too much. I won't keep you past 11 o'clock tonight. If we do, we're into the next day then. But anyway, this is a bird's eye view of Barnesville taken in 1899, and they were done for towns and cities all over the country. But when I first gave this talk at the Chamber of Commerce dinner back in March, I talked about talking to my cousin, Crystal Lorimore, who's the Belmont County CIC director. We were trying to figure out, what made Barnesville different and unique from a lot of other communities? And we decided that there were 2 things. One was its Quaker background, and the other was farming. And why those 2 things? Well, Quakers always have to arrive at consensus, or try to. That didn't always occur. And farming, you have to work with each other, especially not so much today, but certainly in earlier times, to make things happen. So as we move forward this evening and we're talking about some of the things that have happened here in Barnesville, think about that those are 2 common themes. I have lived in Washington, D.C. area since the year 2000, and every time I come to Barnesville, I come through Barnesville to go to Barnesville. This is the exit for Barnesville, Maryland, and it's just a very little small community in the agricultural area of Montgomery County. And it was founded in 1796 by James Barnes. And James Barnes and his wife, he was a shoemaker, and he was also had a grist mill there. And his wife was Nancy Harrison Barnes. But they didn't stay in Barnesville very long. They came to Barnesville, Ohio. But before they got to Barnesville, Ohio, or anybody else in the European settlers, however, there were the indigenous people. And many people say that this is by the Adena people from over 1,000 years ago. But this is Track Rocks, which is located west of Barnesville, There are over 100 inscriptions or carvings in these stones, including what looks to be like an elephant, but it's probably some other thing. There looks like a turtle. They're stretching skins, animal skins. There's an eye, et cetera, et cetera. And Gene Davies and I met with R&F Coal Company probably 40 years ago over in St. Clairsville because this was scheduled to be strip mined, and we talked them out of that. Eventually, it ended up in the hands of Consol, and since 2000, this has been in the hands of the architectural, not an architectural, but an archaeological conservancy, and they now protect it. Brock Rogers of the Barnesville, Belmont County Historical Society Mansion Museum, they had a tour out there this summer. I think you had close to 75 or 100 people that showed up. So anyway, that's the earliest folks here. And then, of course, when the white man arrived, most folks came here certainly after 1800. If you want to know what it was like here before settlement, go to Dysart Woods. Dysart Woods, which was recently donated by the Ohio University to the Captina Conservancy, shows you what it was like here. And the first family to get to Barnesville was a Quaker family from Maryland, and that was Robert Plummer. And this is the Plummer House west or east of Barnesville that's now owned by the Ohio Yearly Meeting, and Marie Bundy has been helping care for that property here in recent years. It was also an inn on the Drovers Road, and the Drovers Road was kind of a competitor to the National Road, where you had to pay tolls, but on the Drovers Road you didn't. And it went from Pulteney, which is south of Bel Air, which was actually the first Belmont County court, where the Belmont County Courthouse was located, west to just near Old Washington. But folks also went on the Drovers Road, and when I was in Barnesville for the Victorian Village Project, I did a trunk tour of the elementary school, and I was telling the children about the fact that when Robert Plummer came here, it took 4 days to cut through the timber to get their wagon from Morristown, Zane's Trace, to this farm. And this one little kid, he raised his hand and said, "Mr. Yarnall?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Well, why didn't they just use a bulldozer?" So that was kind of funny. And anyway, in 1808, James and Nancy, they're going to migrate to Ohio, and he buys this land that's now Barnesville, Ohio, but he doesn't move here immediately. He gets the first resident to come here, who is Reverend James Rounds, a Methodist minister, and he settles on the lot, which is now the corner pharmacy, and he also has a tan yard where they take hides and they tan them. Well, when the village decided to tear down the row building here a couple of years ago, and more about that later, these pits were discovered, and they contacted me with the photos. They said, "Do you have any idea what this is?" Yes, I knew exactly what it was. Unfortunately, it wasn't documented by the Ohio Historical Society. They didn't bother checking with them, but these were the 1808 pits. They also found this piece here. And so that was the first industry in Barnesville. And he was the first citizen. James Barnes and Nancy didn't come here until 1812, is actually when they moved into Barnesville. So who were the first settlers? The white settlers here were the Quakers. And Quakers were having problems with slavery. And as a group, they were, especially the Southern Quakers, they were deciding that this just wasn't the right thing to do, so they wanted to free their slaves, and they also wanted to get out of the slaveholding areas. The Northwest Territory, which was established in 1788, was the first governmental unit in the entire history of the world that said there shall be no slavery. So in 1799, a group of Quakers in North Carolina sent scouts north to check this area out. And they ended up in the area of Coleraine, Ohio. And they went back and they said, yes, this is good land. And they decided to move here. So they moved here. They started moving in 1800. By 1826, there were over 9,000 Quakers in Belmont, Jefferson counties primarily, and also some in Harrison, Guernsey, and Monroe. But there were 9,000 Quakers in this area. Another early group that moved to Barnes, and Barnesville's unique in Belmont County, and we'll get into that later with the Quaker connections. Another early group was the Catholics, and Temperanceville, St. Mary's, is the second oldest parish in the entire state of Ohio. Somerset in Perry County is the oldest, 1811. Temperanceville, which was then called Beaver, was 1819, 1822, roughly. But anyway, we got a few photos here. Temperanceville, a lot of nuns came from Temperanceville, a lot of priests came from Temperanceville, and that photo right there is of Nicholas Gallagher. He was born in the stone house opposite the church in 1846. He went to Columbus, he became a priest. He was the first American-born bishop at the Diocese of Galveston, and he was bishop during the Great Hurricane of 1900. And the other guy there is Edward Creighton, and he was born near Temperanceville, but he left here. He didn't stay here long. He went to Dayton, and from Dayton to Nebraska. And he was a successful businessman, but a devout Catholic, and he and his wife gave the money to form a college basketball powerhouse, Creighton University. So it's named for him. Now, let me just also say, and that book right there, Laura Lee Porter and Pearl Rashman worked on that book. It's up at the library. It's a great book. It tells you the whole history of the parish. Catholics were not looked upon well by the Protestants. Just the truth of it. I mean, in the 1850s, it was the Know-Nothing Party, and they were anti-immigrant. What goes on today went on before. If you want to know history, it just repeats itself. The Catholics eventually left, or migrated. A lot of them migrated to Barnesville. Well, the parish in Barnesville it was started where where the Catholic cemetery is. That's where they got their start. They bought the land for the cemetery in 1871. The church wasn't established until 1891. Why were the Catholics down there at that location? Well, it was actually outside of the corporation limits at the time. So, written or unwritten, these things go on. Another group that it's unique to this area are the African Americans. And this is Captina, or Captina, as some people say. But I found in 1858 when the Ohio the folks trying to get folks to move back to Liberia, came here, they called it Guinea. So we know that it was Guinea, but it was established, the church was established there in 1824 in a grove that still exists just north of the old Howells Airport. The AME church wasn't founded until 1816, so that's only 8 years later. Now, why was the church formed? Why was the AME church formed? Because the whites would not allow the blacks to be seated on the main floor. If you want to see a church building today that exemplifies this, go to Center Wheeling, go to St. Alphonsus Church, and the balcony that's up in the back is where the blacks were seated before the end of slavery. But why did they come to Ohio? Well, we just said slavery wasn't allowed here. But here's some other reasons. One of the ones that was recorded in the Guernsey County history book by Wolfe, who was a historian in 1938, 1939, talks about Silky Wooten Turner. She was freed by her master upon the death of his wife, and she came here. She was manumitted. She took her papers and she fled. Well, why did she flee Virginia? Because in 1806, Virginia passed a law that if you were freed, you had 1 year to get out of the state. Because they didn't want free people around the slaves, because that would make the slaves think that perhaps that was something that they would be interested in as well. But before we get too high and mighty and think, well, Ohio was, this was a great place for everybody, let me give you some information regarding the Ohio laws, the black laws passed between 1804 and 1838. If you were going to reside in the state of Ohio, you had to secure employment. You had to post a bond of $500 signed by 2 white people, ensuring that you were of good character. Blacks were permitted from attending schools, performing military duty, jury duty, and testifying against whites. Now, a lot of these laws just simply weren't enforced because this was more of an anti-slavery area. Guinea, Captina was on the Underground Railroad, and that's the tombstone of Sandy L. Alexander Harper, who is buried there, and he was the Underground Railroad conductor there. And there were Underground Railroad conductors in Somerton, Quaker City, Barnesville, etc. That book there was written by Henry Burke, who was a historian friend of mine from Marietta, and it's a fictionalized story, but it goes through the escaping slaves go through Captina and on up. And in 2002, during the Ohio Bicentennial roll-up, we did that marker, which the state of Ohio put up. So there is a marker there because the church is gone and the area is gone as well. So what was one of the early cash tobacco or crops? It was tobacco. And as the story is repeated, James Price, who was a minister who migrated here, began that production in 1819. And it was a good cash crop. The ground was fertile. But tobacco also stripped a lot of the nutrients out of the ground, and that was another difficult problem. It was grown, it would be dried, and then it was taken to the packing house. James Barnes had a packing house. There were several packing houses in Barnesville. They were loaded into hogsheads. And if you want to know what a hogshead is, go over here to the depot and look at that wooden thing that's there next to the cigar. That would hold 900 pounds of tobacco. And they would pack it up and they would send it to the market in Baltimore. Well, before the railroad arrived, that had to go by wagon over the National Road, or the Zanes Trace and the National Road. They could put maybe 3 on each wagon, and then they would haul it off. So that was really the first cash crop here, and that really played out in this country, or this area, for almost a full century. So in the early 1840s, that's photo up in the far corner. That's Isaac Barnes. He was the first mayor of Barnesville in 1835, 1836, son of James Barnes. The original painting for that is hanging in the municipal building. And the house next to him that looks like a house in the store, that's actually the Barnes store that was located where First National Bank and now Ohio Hills Health Service is located. And also, I'm going to show you 2 other houses. That house in the lower corner, on the far corner, was the Reed Mansion, and they had several industries here in town, and that was located here until 1968 when it was torn down. And the building in the middle is still there temporarily because that's the former site of Foster's and half of what was Harp's Restaurant, and then later Patrick's, which is slated to be torn down by the new owner. Now, James Barnes still owned land back in Maryland. So he went back to Maryland, and in 1843, he went to Maryland to take care of business, and he was returning by stagecoach. He was 75 years old, he got sick, and he died in Grantsville. So every time I come on Route 68, I go through Grantsville, I think of James Barnes. He was buried there. 1939, 1936 through 1939, we had several events here in Barnesville called the Pioneer Days. So they dug him up and they brought him back here to the Southern Cemetery. So they think. And when I used to do tours, I'd tell folks, well, did they or didn't they? Or on the Day of Judgment, will somebody else wake up in Barnesville and say, where am I? We don't know. So Barnesville in 1818 thought they could become a county seat. Everybody wanted to become a county seat. Well, you can see why, because there's a lot of commerce there. So they were going to do it. They did a survey, and they did a petition to the state, and they wanted to become a new county seat. And the reason was the distance between St. Clairsville and Cambridge. And it is quite some distance. Yeah. St. Clairsville is 12 miles from the river, but when St. Clairsville was selected as the Belmont County seat, they renamed Newellstown St. Clairsville in honor of Territorial Governor James St. Clair, and they showed it on the map as being further west than it actually is. Later, Belmont changed their name from Wrightstown to Belmont, thinking they were going to get a county seat as well. But anyway, we did the petition, nothing happened. In 1847, it happened again. But in 1847, 1851, another county was actually formed, and that's Noble County, which is just to the west and south of us, including the Batesville area. And Noble County was not named for the hills; it was named for a state legislature that they influenced to allow them to become a county. So politics in the 1840s is different than the politics today. So anyway, then what changed for Barnesville was the arrival of the railroad. James Barnes, they claimed, said because he didn't get the national road through here, that someday the iron rail and the railroad in the 1820s already was, they knew about it. So in 1854, the Central Ohio Railroad came. It was from Newark to Bel Air. It was headquartered in Newark, but it went from Columbus to Bel Air. And it came into Barnesville in 1854 in August. And the steepest grade was the Barnesville grade, Barnesville Hill. Yeah, and it was always a problem. But the company struggled, and it was beginning in 1866. It was managed by the B&O Railroad and eventually went under. And when it went under, then they became part of the B&O system. The depot was originally located down what was later Pomco and is now Village Hardware. And they found out that grade didn't work, so they moved it over to where it is now, and that's where it was for the rest of the time. In 1872, the Barnesville Tunnel was built. Before that, it was just an open cut. And of course, they built buildings on top of that. All those buildings are not there anymore, but anyway, that's how the Barnesville Tunnel came along. So it's a man-made tunnel. It's not done that. Then along comes the Civil War. That guy there's John Hunt Morgan. He supposedly came through Barnesville and stopped at the Parker House west of town because he would bring cattle through here on the Drovers Road. So they claimed that he knew the area. But he was a cavalry general in the South, and of course he decided they were going to raid the North. They were going to show them what's going on. This is what is today Old Washington, where the skirmish occurred, and 4 Confederate soldiers were killed, and they're buried here in the cemetery in Old Washington. At Campbell Station, which is Lower City today, they burnt down the tobacco warehouse and a few other things. But they thought they were going to come to Barnesville because the wooden trestle at Bailey's Mills, because he could then put the railroad out of business. Okay, so they everyone thought, well, let's see what happens here, and so they went down to protect the trestle, and it was called Camp Trestle. All of them were volunteers, but as a result of all of this, there were 4 companies formed only here and in the state of Ohio, 1 in Henrysburg, 1 in Somerton, and 2 in Barnesville. They were called Departmental Corps. So they were home guards. So they were going to be ready for the next time that something came up. And this is a photograph that George Chaffee found for us. This is where the municipal building is today, and that's one of the companies from Barnesville. They're practicing, getting ready to protect the thing. Over there is a letter that's in my possession that I bought on eBay from the provost marshal of who was David McCartney for the entire congressional district, and he is the one who directed the men to go down there. Of course, they were telegraphing back and forth, and they thought they were actually talking with Morgan, but they weren't quite sure of it. And where was Provost Marshal's office? It was on the 2nd story of a building that the village just recently tore down, unfortunately, on West Main Street. So it was up on the 2nd floor, and more about this building later when we talk about the post office. But that's where his office was located, in that building right there that predated the Civil War. So the other thing that happened, and shortly after all of this was, then they decided that they were going to, they needed to get the troops from the eastern flank to the west. So in September of 1863, the largest domestic movement of American troops in U.S. history on American ground occurred when 25,000 men were transferred from the Eastern Theater to the Western Theater, and they went through Barnesville. Okay? They went through here now, they crossed the Ohio River on boat because the viaduct, the bridge that's down there now, it wasn't built until 1872. But that's the largest movement of American soldiers in history, and it literally went through this community. So after the Civil War, then Barnesville decided to get back into its agricultural business. The first jerseys west of the Allegheny Mountains were in Barnesville. And James and Edgerton and his wife brought them here. And these are from a couple of our calendars that we put out over the years. And of course, that is a cow down there taken a few years ago by Journey's Inn Farm, which was the farm of out here off of Warren Avenue. And L.P. Bailey of Tacoma, Ohio, whose ad is over there. If you've heard of the Bailey Farm, he and his wife, I mean, they won awards at World's Fairs and all kinds of places. But Barnesville was known as, and for many, many years, up through the 1930s, there was a Belmont County Jersey Cattle Club, had a show here every year at the Rogers Farm out in Spinell. And I mean, it was big business. Eventually, milk, that was highly prized for butter and cream. And, you know, then we got away from that. But anyway, that was the jerseys, the first jerseys west of the Alleghenies was here in Barnesville, Ohio. Barnesville was also the strawberry capital of the world. So a lot of the Quaker families especially raised strawberries. And I mean, that's a short crop every year. But this is and of course what made it possible were the refrigerated cars with ice in them on the B&O Railroad. So they could ship them from here to Baltimore and Washington and Chicago. And that, of course, is a young lady with her little hod carrying that. This is down at the Barnesville Depot, and these are some of the workers, and there are the berry baskets there, you can see them. And that's Isaac P. Lane, whose house was located on South Lincoln Avenue, down the street from you. Unfortunately, Jake, it's now gone. And he was the station agent here at Barnesville. So Barnesville was the strawberry capital of the world. Well, we also got an industry. In 1862, James Watt came here from the great town of Malaga, Ohio, in Monroe County. And he made some money here, believe it or not. So they started Watt Foundry up in a building that is on where the city fire station is now. And in 1891, they moved to the current area where we are. There you can see where we are at the present time. There's part of the house that we're in. And Governor McKinley, who later became President McKinley, dedicated this factory in 1891. He came here, and it was at one time the largest rail car manufacturing factory in the world, concern in the world. This photo I bought recently this past year on eBay. Dave Adair, who's here with us from Cambridge, dated it, and I forget the exact date, but I'm thinking maybe 1915 or something like that. But that's out here. There's the factory in the background, and you can see the cars loaded. And so that was a car that they were leading with. But as I said, it was the largest factory. And there's an ad from the 1920s. Watt Car Services Worldwide, the Watt Car and Wheel Company, Barnesville, Ohio. And then look down here, you're going to see all of the places that they have offices. There were like 8 different cities in the United States where they had offices selling their cars. That lasted until 1995, and I was, the Enterprise at the time was able to photograph the last men coming through those very doors when the factory closed. So there were other factories here as well. There was T&A Rogers Company, and T&A Rogers Company was located down where Village Hardware is now, but was originally called the Rogers Planing Mill. They made a lot of different products, including they had a patent on a kitchen table that's out at the museum. They made the North Star washer. They made porch swings. They made all kinds of things. And up here, this is the 1908 Barnesville Centennial Parade. Look at the log that's on that truck, T&A Rogers Lumber. The other one was Hagen Woodward, Smith Lumber Company. Later on, this became Smith Lumber Company. But anyway, both of these were planing mills. A lot of the houses were built here. That's where the lumber came from, and that's where the finished lumber came from. So where did these guys live? Mr. Haig built this house for himself up on East South Street that's still there. This house over here was Mr. Woodward, his partner and half-brother. This was located at 216 North Chestnut Street until about a year and a half ago when the village of Barnesville decided to tear it down. So that was his house. And then the Rogers brothers had two houses, twin houses on North Chestnut Street. This is the rear of the house that Bob Ney once lived in, and you can see what it looks like today. And I was here in December, and the front door happened to be open on that Sunday, and of course you know me. I just stepped up, I didn't go in too far, but I did get a photograph of the stairway. But this, my friends, is what happens where I work in historic preservation. This is called demolition by neglect. And it takes two people to do demolition by neglect. One, the owner, and two, the municipality or city or county or whatever by not enforcing their laws. So sadly, we're going to lose this one soon. So if you haven't photographed, do so. And this is the best of all of them. This is the Albanese house, which is the old was the Rogers Robinson house. Tom Robinson, whose mother was a Rogers, lived there, and Mrs. Albanese lives there now. So that's a beautiful house there. Now, talk about Quakers. We're going to bring the Quakers back again. And I said the Quakers provided consensus. Not always. They split in 1826 or 27, 28 between the Hicksites and the Orthodox. And then in the 1850s, they had another split, the Orthodox did, between the Gurneyites and the Wilburites. Those names came from the two men, Mr. Gurney and Mr. Wilbur, that they followed. And Barnesville ended up staying in the Wilbur camp. But they had a school in Mount Pleasant. It was built in 1837, and they fought over control over it. So it went to court. And it went to court, and they found in favor of the Gurneys. It mysteriously burned a few days later to the ground. Nobody knows why or how, but it did. So the Wilbur branch, the conservative branch today, came to Barnesville. Whoops, what did I just do? All right, came to Barnesville, and they built this building here in 1878. It was 3 stories high. The boys' dorm was on one side, the girls' dorm was on the other, and the classrooms were on the first and second floor. Okay? Then, this is the school that was in Mount Pleasant that burned in 1876. The school was actually built in 1876. If I said 1878, I'm wrong. And then in 1878, the conservative group came to Barnesville and built this, which is now called the Ohio Yearly Meeting House. And if you've been to Mount Pleasant, it's copied on the Mount Pleasant Meeting House that was built in 1814. It's a state memorial. And there is the school today. We'll talk about why it's 2 stories today as opposed to 3 stories back then. Then, kind of agriculturally related, but if any of you have ever been to Barnesville Memorial Park, this was originally the Barnesville Fairgrounds. And the Barnesville District Fair was established in 1870. And there's the, right there is the grandstand. There's the racetrack. It was a 1/3 of a mile racetrack, but it only ran from 1870 to 1892 when it closed. There were a few other buildings out there as well. This is the Barnesville Canning and Packing Company that was located on South Chestnut Street, peddling their products at the Barnesville Fair. And there's a couple of ads in East Cheppy had that one, and that one came out of the Barnesville Whetstone. But after the fair folded in 1892, then it was used for various purposes. In 1903, the village of Barnesville bought it, and it was renamed City Park. Now, mind you, Barnesville wasn't a city then. Barnesville's only been a city for a couple of days in its entire history. But anyway, every year then they would have the fall races, and they were very popular. In 1910, in the book that Mary showed you, I have a postcard. They had an aeroplane came here, and he did all of the flying around and everything, but he crashed. And several women fainted as a result of it. And I have a photo of the aftermath of that in the book, which was a postcard taken. And of course, they had to, dismantle the aeroplane and take it somewhere else. Anyway, that's the story of that. And of course, that's why Memorial Park is where it is today. In 1895, Barnesville had its most tragic fire, and they had a lot of them. A lot of towns had fires. But anyway, in 1895, January 12th and 13th, frigid, 20, 30 below zero, if the thermometers were correct at that time, fire started in this block here. This is today's Ohio Hills Health Center. It was built in 1891 by the Bradfield family. It was called the Bradfield Block. So this is only 4 years later. The Bradfields had the intelligence to put iron shutters on that side of the building. So when the fire started, they made sure they got the shutters closed so that the fire didn't get over and take that building as well. But it literally wiped out everything from that building up to the alley. You can see the new central block, which was built in 1886 here, that's still there today. The Enterprise was located right here in the Gunning building. And of course, we lost all of the Enterprise files from May 28, 1866. This particular lithograph print here was in the Barnesville Republican the following week, which was one of the other papers. Also want to mention that this was the heyday. Everybody had to work a lot before the Civil War. It was all manual labor, but with all the inventions that came along after the Civil War, there was people in towns especially had some free time. These photos are all taken from the 1908 Centennial Parade, but it was the heyday of social and fraternal organizations. The Masons came here in 1827, the Oddfellows in 1851, and they built the new central block that I just showed you a minute ago. But let me give you the names of some of the other groups that were here in the fourth quarter of the 1800s. Grove of Druids, Wigwam of Red Men, Knights of Pythias, Order of the Mystic Knights of the Golden Eagle, Junior Order of the United American Mechanics, Modern Woodmen, the Maccabees, and they have the Lady Maccabees as well, Sons of Temperance, and then there was another group, because I'm going to get back and talk about racial aspects of it, only the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the Civil War veterans, and the women's group, the Women's Relief Corps, were integrated. And the men were integrated because they fought together in the Civil War against the southern states, and the women, of course, did as well. I didn't have a photo here, but I've got the women marching in the Barnesville Memorial Day Parade, and there's a black woman in the, probably in the second row, so I know that it was likewise integrated. Now, the African Americans in Barnesville also had a colored Oddfellows Lodge from 1884 to 1900. And today, if you've heard of Prince Hall Masons, that's an African American Masonic order, and they're all over in Washington, D.C. But anyway, they still exist. So anyway, that was the heyday, and of course, today there aren't so many people in organizations like that. These are the public buildings at the time. This is the public school, the central school. It was built in 1880. It was 3 stories high, and of course later that third story was condemned in the 1940s, and that's why we had to build it. Well, even before that, we had to build the new high school in 1905, and then later the entire building. This was the City Township building, built in 1876, and there was a large meeting hall up on the second floor. It met its demise in 1896 when it burnt to the ground. There's the Belmont County Children's Home, and most of us probably remember that. Well, with all the other activities going on in the eastern part of the county or the central part of the county, why did the Children's Home get out here? Because they thought that the air would be better for the children. So, but anyway, it came out here. And then this photo down here I want to show you. You see, this is a public building too. This is the current site of the Barnesville Masonic Lodge on South Chestnut and Street. That was the African American elementary school from 1855 when the Barnesville Public Schools was established until 1887 when the state of Ohio said, no more are we going to have segregated education. It's going to be integrated. There were 2 schools at Flat Rock, Captina, where I'm from. They had two schools as well. I think probably they were glad to be able to integrate because it was an additional expense. But this was after that time in 1887 when the Barnesville schools were integrated. Then this was turned into a residence, and it was torn down in 1938. So by the time of the turn of the century, Barnesville was really, really booming. In 1850, Barnesville had 750 people, Morristown had 350, but Morristown was on the national road. By 1900, Barnesville had 3,721 people, and Morristown had Wheeling, Lodi, Waterford. I think they were also in Martins Ferry, but this is the old Barnesville building right here. That's a photo Gene had, and there they were doing home delivery of milk at the time. This is the building as I remember in the 1970s and 1980s. This is the United Dairy Crew at the Kiwanis Community Business Fair in 1961. And there's a lid, and that's a lid from evaporated milk. Now, they did condensed milk here. And that was really great in World War II because we had to get milk and nutrients to the troops all over the world. So there were United Dairy boxes all over the world. Eventually, condensed milk went out of favor, and in 1981, the business was closed. The United Dairy in Martins Ferry, although the former owner wouldn't admit it, he argued with us on that, descends from this factory here. Then in 1908, we had a centennial and it was 100 years. This is a photo of mine. This was a history display up in that new central building of old things from Barnesville. There's the T&A Rogers thing again, a little larger. And there were a lot of wagons. There was one motorized entry, and that was by Mr. Ed Bradfield, who owned the Bradfield store. And that was the only one there, but I didn't include that. And this is the program. Now, back to race. African Americans, they weren't excluded from attending any of these events over August 30th, September 5th, but they were given their own day. And on September 1st, 1908, it was called Colored Citizens Rally and Parade. And in the photographic history book that we put out in 2008, there's a photo of them dancing in the middle of the street. So oftentimes we here in the North, because we were on the winning side and we didn't hold slaves, we think that we were pure, but Jim Crow existed indirectly here as well. It wasn't just there. So anyway, it was a big day. It was a big celebration. But then in 1910, I told you there was the 3-story building at Olney. In April, it caught fire and it burnt. There's photos from my collection of the interior of the building after it burnt. And of course, the Ohio Yearly Meeting made the decision that they had the house in Tacoma was used as a temporary classroom, and another house or two. And there's the crew of whites and blacks who built the building. It's still in existence today. So they were resilient. I talked about cooperation and building and not giving up. That's what happened. Whoops, going the wrong way again. And here we go. Then the garment industry started. In 1911, the Harrison Shirt Factory began out on 511 East Main Street, but it was down over the hill. And later it was International Harvester. And later that it was East Main Street Flea Market. That was located there. McClellan Manufacturing Company, they made men's overhauls and had a big, they made shirts here, by the way, Harrison Shirt Factory. They made men's overhauls, and that was located in the Barnesville Antique Mall building, and they had a pretty good World War I contract. But you can see there that they sent 1 2/3 dozen pants to this store in Burke, West Virginia, and it cost $36 a dozen. So anyway, and then after World War II, Hainsley Mills replaced Harrison Shirt Factory. My grandmother worked there. They made men's underwear. They let the women make men's underwear. And they said after World War II, they were also in a couple of other buildings. We're not going to come back unless the community builds us a new building. And we built this building here in 1948, which was to be for Hainsley. And Hainsley then decided not to come back. And it was sold to the Campus Shirt Company of Cleveland, Ohio. And I can tell you that I worked at that factory for several months in the summer of 1954 before I was born. Before Mom took off, yes, I worked at the Campus Shirt Factory. And the girls, they were primarily women, but these were the Bluebirds. They wore blue uniforms, and eventually that became Jonathan Logan. For a short period of time, Burns Apparel, and then later, of course, we tried to get and 5Bs was in there, and we had them in there for 10 years, and now it's about to go into a new iteration with a new and exciting business that Mr. Lucas, who's a local resident, is going to start. Another company that started about the turn of the century was the McClellan Kennard Company, and it was called the M&K Stores. They were company-owned stores. This building up here was the original warehouse And when you leave here, if you go back to Mulberry Street and you turn right, the foundation is still there. Later, after they built this building here on South Chestnut Street, where I worked when it was the Pompco warehouse, they sold that to United Dairy. And United Dairy, when I was in high school, United Dairy used this building up here to the left as their as part of their warehousing. 1936-37, they built this massive big building down at the location of the old T&A Rogers planing mill. And here was the old M&K store on North Chestnut Street, which is now an auto parts dealership. But they were company-owned stores. They peaked at 64 stores. They had stores in Zanesville. They had stores all over the place. But they really weren't able to compete with the Krogers and the national companies that were coming along. And a lot of them were, storefronts in the middle of Main Street. They weren't the big, but they did build new stores in Zanesville and a few other towns and tried to compete, and it just didn't work. Well, when Albert S. George, who was the general manager of the company, died suddenly in the early 60s, they decided to sell it. They sold it to the Nichols Bakery Company. They ran it for a short period of time. They then sold it to the Potter McCune Company of McKeesport, Pennsylvania, and that's where the name Pomco came from, and that's where I spent my college summers working in that warehouse. This building right here, which when I was a kid was Ralph's Super Dollar, Ralph's Willis's Super Dollar, that was actually the second bakery building, the first bakery building that burnt in 1936, and Gene Davies remembers that night. It was a cold night. It was located where what I call the junior high gymnasium is there at West Main and North Broadway. And so then they built this down there and then eventually went from there. The company basically, once Potter McCune took over, they sold the businesses to the store managers primarily, and then they serviced them, and Pompco pulled out of here in the 1980s. Lotus Glass Company, 1915. 1912, excuse me, and it ran from 1912 until 1996. Unlike many of the other factories in Eastern Ohio and Northern West Virginia, they did not manufacture glass, but it was a decorating company. So here are some of the things from my collection, but they would etch glass, they would put gold on glass, and they had sales representatives all over the country as well. Lotus Glass was in the Kennedy White House. Lotus Glass was at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. And of course, the world changes and everything happens. Their last big blurb was this right here, black gold. And nobody even thought much about it until they saw it on the television station Dallas, show Dallas. Well, then everybody wanted it. All the folks in the oil industry wanted it, and folks here locally did as well. And it closed in 1996. The story of all of the other businesses in the United States that foreign competition eventually did them in. So then, have you ever heard of Barnesville State University? Do you know what almost happened? In the state of Ohio decided in the 19-teens that they had the Ohio University and they had Miami of Ohio. They were going to put 3 more universities in the state. These were going to be normal schools for teachers. They were going to put one in Northwest, one in Northeast, and one in Eastern Ohio. Okay? So this is the book where they brought the folks in here and wined and dined. Well, they probably didn't wine them in those days, but they dined them and showed them all around Barnesville. And we've got a copy of that book. And, they showed them, here's all the great things in Barnesville. Well, Barnesville was in competition for it. Caddis was in competition for it. Cambridge was in competition for it. But the Muskingum College folks were not happy about Cambridge, and they really didn't want anything else to happen in this part of the state either, because that was going to be competition. So what did it result in? Bowling Green State University, Kent State University, and Barnesville wasn't selected, Caddis was, but politics being what politics is and was, they got in, it never happened. So this never happened. So, but it's an interesting story. Well, then came World War I and the Spanish flu epidemic. And of course, having just been through a pandemic, or we're still in a pandemic, you can see these are the ladies from the I'm going to go back. These are the ladies from Bradfield's store out at Route 40, National Road, which kind of indicative of the fact that already by World War I, the railroad was starting to lose importance to the automobile. But and there's some Boy Scouts too. They were giving out stuff to folks, and they were, playing nursemaid, etc. There are some soldiers, not from Barnesville, but you can see they were wearing masks, just like we had to wear here recently. And then in the center of Barnesville, so we say we here in the United States are good people, but in World War II, we hated the Japanese, and they went through a lot of persecution. In World War I, it was the Germans. Schiller Park in German Village in Columbus was renamed Washington Park. The German bank in Wheeling was renamed Wheeling National Bank. So all of those names were Americanized, and people in Barnesville, what did we do? They outlawed the teaching of German as a second language in schools. So the good students from Barnesville, being patriotic as they are, they went to the center of town and they burnt all of the school books. Yeah. Which is interesting because you think 15 years later, they're doing it in Germany, and we think, oh, this is terrible during Hitler's Germany. But one other quick sideline, this pole was put up during the war because we're patriotic and we're going to fly the American flag. So it's right in the middle of Chestnut and Main. Well, after the war, the state highway department said, you got to get rid of this thing because it's impeding traffic. And what did Barnesville say? We're not going to get rid of this thing. So in 1923, the state of Ohio came in and cut it down. So, where there's a will, there's a way. Then also, I'd mentioned about wining and dining, that group this was a Protestant area and, very much anti-saloon, etc. This in October 23rd, 1914, there was a dry rally in Barnesville and a parade. These students here are actually standing on the balcony at what was later the Moose Building and is today Johnson's Pottery. And on that balcony on Saturday nights in those days, they would put the orchestra up there and they would play for the folks. But anyway, they're watching the parade. You can see that it's getting ready to go through town. And it's, right there they are, the students, they're all marching, we're against alcohol and so on. Barnesville's mayor was James W. White, and James W. White, or James A. White, he was very much anti-saloon. So here is a pamphlet that I own that I bought where he talked about how he got rid of the blind tiger and how to get rid of the speakeasies in town and what and there was a lot of articles in the paper. They would send people in to make the buys, and then you didn't actually see the person you were buying it from. That was the whole idea. You were buying the White Lightning, so there was no direct contact. So I always liken it to a little bit like a dumbwaiter. You'd put your money in and it would go up and down would come your liquor. He left Barnesville. He resigned his position. He went to Columbus, Worthington, and was named the president of the Ohio Anti-Saloon League, and later ran as a Republican for the gubernatorial nomination in the 1920s, but did not win. But of course, Great Depression came along. And after the Great Depression came along, we got rid of Prohibition, and every place was clear to sell liquor then. So then they had to go back and vote on things again. Well, Barnesville was always 3/4 of town was dry, 1/4 southwest part of town was normally wet, and that's where more of the workers lived versus the merchants and the folks who were in the upper crust. And so Barnesville, they did vote wet, and there was a state liquor store here in the bottom of the basement of the citizen, or it's now the corner drugstore. And but then when Barnesville voted dry, it had to go. So what did they do? There was a guy in Barnesville and by the name of Denny, and he went down to Somerset Township, just at the line where 148 and 800, and he built what later in my life was called the Watkins Products Building, and that was a bar there. Eventually, Somerton people voted it dry too, and that put Cliff Denny out of business. But anyway, 1916, 1917, we got a new railroad station. And we are like a lot of other folks. Cambridge and Barnesville were the two places that got the new stations. This was taken shortly after the station was built. You can see here the brick for the road that still exists today. And there's the glass factory over here. So that was a big move up, and rail passenger traffic peaked during World War I. Well, but then 1921 became an omen. This is the factory that I just showed you. And these are photos from Marie when the factory burned in 1921. And this is a bottle that was made there by Kearns Gersh Company that I found on eBay. And so it was actually manufactured in Barnesville. And just a week later, or vice versa, the Roby Cigar Company burnt, and the Roby Cigar Company employed several hundred people. These are some of their products here. Where was the Roby Cigar Company located? Does anybody know? Chestnut Lanes. Aha! And Chestnut, that was a surface parking lot until Chestnut Lanes was built in 1963. And interestingly enough, Chestnut Lanes burned at the same location. Well, then we had our bank scandal in 1923. The cashier at the National Bank of Barnesville, which is now Hartley Marshall, he was playing the stock market, and which he shouldn't have done. But that was before FDIC, et cetera, and he was taking all the money out of it. And then he ran into more trouble, and he started getting into the lock boxes, and he took money out of there. And then he suddenly got sick and he died suddenly, and everybody was just aghast that he had died because he was very much loved by the community, and they had a big funeral for him. And the next week they went in and found out all of the money was missing. Well, that tanked the bank, and in today's dollars, it would be a $10.5 million loss. But there were two more banks that are going to tank here shortly as well. The largest department store in Belmont County was the Harrison's Department Store, which is now called the Bohandy Building by most folks. The front part of it was built in 1901 by the Campbell brothers. And right here you can see this line. That's the front part of the building, 1901. And 1923, Harrison built the rest of it. It was a complete department store. It had a bargain basement. It had the third story. It had everything. This particular photo was taken when all the employees were going on their company picnic to the Belmont County Fairgrounds. And look at those little and this is a Christmas card from Santa Claus that I have in my collection. And he says, "Dear little friend, I'll be here at Toyland at Harrison's until December 16th. And I want you to come." So it folded. After that, it was called the Arcade because Fred Peters, who owned the Conservative Life Insurance Company in Wheeling, West Virginia, held the mortgage. And it was actually a mall. Walter Thomas store got its start there. The Bears Furniture Store started there as well. Eventually, it became A&P and then KV Store, et cetera. But that's the history of that building. But people were suffering as well. This is a family that came from Quaker City. These photos were on the National Wire Services in the news at the time. They were homeless. She was pregnant. They had the baby. There's the chicken. There's the manger. This was in the horse barn at Barnesville City Park because they still had the races, and they ended up out there, and the word got out that she'd had a baby, and there's the bed and that's where they were living in. And it was printed all over the country. Well, then there were also coal mines, unions, and strikes. And right there is my dear friend Dave Adair from Cambridge, who's with us this evening, dressed up as he should be in all times with his smudges. But the mines here were primarily down towards Bailey's Mills, down the creek that way, and most of them were unionized, and there was just a lot of strife. There were Nick Majors, who was Barnesville mayor at one time back in the 60s. His father was a security guard for the company, and he was shot and killed during these troubles. But anyway, that pretty much finished that area out, and that was the end of the deep coal mining in this area to any great extent. The Barnesville Enterprise in 1922, Charles Lee, whose parents had both died in 1912 and 1916 before him, died suddenly, and his young daughter couldn't keep up the paper. And this guy down here, L.J. Bailey, who was from Barnesville, and he was master of the Ohio Grange and later master of the National Grange. This photo of him is taken in Boise, Idaho in 1938 during the National Grange Convention. but he was master of the Ohio Grange. So he went to the court and he knew the Barnesville paper was about to fold. He was at the State House. He put a note up on the State House in the press corps office room. It says, anybody who's interested in running a small town newspaper, contact me. Well, Ray Palmer, Jean's dad, who was originally from Martins Ferry, did just that. And that's Jean's mother and dad in the press room in the back. They came here. There's their little dog. And he was an Esquire, by the way, but I forget the rest of his name. But anyway, they won awards, state awards in the 1960s. The newspaper peaked at 5,800. It was a phenomenal newspaper. And we have them to thank, and we have Gene and Bill to thank for the many, many years of service. And that, when I talk about keeping a community together, that newspaper kept this community together. There was the Barnesville Whetstone too, but don't get me wrong, it was the Barnesville Enterprise. And what else came along about that time? The Barnesville Hospital. 1930, when it was first proposed, it was going to be, this is out of the Barnesville Enterprise. It was going to be out on West Main Street where it ended up, but there's the mansion, the old house there, and it was going to be behind that, and they were going to tear that house down. Well, what ended up being built in 1954 was the hospital, and I was born right there, by the way. And there's the old house back there that was torn down in 1974, which is here as well, Barnesville General Hospital. There is the planning committee when they built the 1964 addition on the east side. And there's the most recent thing, which was the 2018 expansion or redo of the emergency room department. Barnesville was a Republican community, but Barnesville folks were not crazy about taking government money. Okay, but WPA came along and times were tough. But anyway, FDR forced a new post office on us. So there it is, 1934, finished and dedicated in 1935, and there it is today. A number of years ago, that eagle had disappeared, and Barnesville being what it is, they made sure it was replaced. And I think it was a guy from the post office that worked here at the time that actually did the carving. And Gene took a photograph of them on the front steps there. But anyway, that was the Barnesville post office, and it is yet today. And like a lot of those post offices, there was a mural in it. Well, the Barnesville mural was taken down in 1974 by the post office department, supposedly rolled up and taken to Zanesville, Ohio for storage to be brought back again. And WPA, they paid these artists to do this work. And the artist who did the one in Barnesville was Michael Sarkiski, who was born in 1906 and died in 1974. He was from Cleveland. And so nobody knew where it went. And we tried, people tried to check out and find out. Well, one day in the Washington Post here, about 15, 18 years ago, there was an article about these WPA murals. And it said that a lot of them are photographed. The photographs of them are in the Library of Congress. And I go, wow. So I contacted the state historic, or the post office preservation officer, which is the equivalent of my office. And he said, yeah, we've got one of the Barnesville. It's in that collection. So it wasn't cheap, but this is what they sent me. And it's a black and white of the color version. And we put an article in the paper at the time. And Catherine then, Stanley, who's with us tonight, wrote this up after Twyla Fisher, local artist, and with support of the Belmont County Historical Society, painted that, and that's in the post office again. Not every community would do this, but Barnesville did. So anyway, it's there now if you want to see it. And here's the original drawing that he did before it was accepted. Whoops, going the wrong way. JCPenney's came here in 1938. That was big news. I mean, that meant we had come into the retail business world. And the new building that was built for them by Mr. Bohandy was on East Main Street. And of course, this was the first ad in the Barnesville Enterprise for that store. Men's shorts and shirts, 10 cents each. Fancy dress shirts for boys, 33 cents. Slips, rayon taffeta, 34 cents. Anyway, December 22nd, 1960, it caught fire. And a lot of people had stuff in layaway. Mom had just gotten my brother's cowboy hat out hours earlier. But I was majorly concerned because my dad from Somerton had to come up and cover that fire. what were they going to do with Santa Claus? That's where Santa Claus was in those days. At the end, they decided not to come back, unfortunately. And that 1960, I call the high tide of Barnesville retailing. Then in 1940, it was Barnesville. Barnesville, Ray Palmer always called it the city district. Well, shoot, it wasn't a city. You had to have 5,000 people to have a city in Ohio. So in 1940, the census came in, and the census said Barnesville had 5,002 people. Then the city fathers realized that they had to have a paid health department, they had to have a paid fire department, and it was going to cost all this extra money. So what are we going to do? So they had one family out here off of Mount Olivet Road that owned this parcel, and there were 4 of them. And they said, would you ask to be de-annexed? And they did. They did a special census in 1941, and wow, 4,998. We made it. From a standpoint of advertising and so on, that's when I think Ray Palmer was involved in this as well. And I don't have a postcard that specifically says this, but there was some advertising. Barnesville, the high in Ohio. That's because Barnesville at 1,275 feet is the tallest city or highest city community elevation-wise in the state of Ohio. Well, then World War II came along, and of course, December 7th, 1941, we've all heard of that. There was the home, folks, this is the Barnesville Civilian Defense Council air raid. If an air raid comes, telling the folks in Barnesville what to do. This would have been in the window of the local fire air raid warden, and they went around and made sure you had your curtains pulled and the blackouts. After we got the depot in 1991, which was the 50th anniversary of the attack, we invited all of the veterans who had left Barnesville, because they all left here by rail. They marched many of them from downtown to the depot, and there's the group that showed up, and they marched in the Christmas parade that day. And then they came back to the depot, and we gave them hot dogs and I don't know what else. Unfortunately, here we are all these years later. I think probably there are none left that made that march that day, but that was a grand day. Okay, let me get back up here. Then, of course, Barnesville Memorial Park came along, and a lot of communities didn't have anything like this. This is Brooks Wigington. He was the landscape architect for Ogilvy Park, which is one of the finest city municipal parks in the entire world, and in this country, certainly. And there's what was the Crystal Pool that's now the Memorial Park Pool. And of course, this was dedicated in memory of the soldiers in basically World War I and World War II. There's the Albert S. George Youth Center that was built in the 1960s. And we're still adding things to the park yet to this day. But we can thank the folks that bought the land for the fairgrounds back in 1870 for that. How many have heard of Kirk's of Barnesville? Yeah. Listen, before the malls, this was the thing that drew people into Barnesville. Here's an ad. There's John Donald Kirk. There's a shirt from one of the guys that worked for him. There's the sign that used to be on the back of the building. In Barnesville, this is out of the Barnesville yearbook. In Barnesville, for folks living 100 miles distance, you save $1 a mile every inch of the way. Ask your neighbor who's been here. Walter Thomas store did great off of business from Kirk's. My college mentor, Laura Lee Porter at Muskingum College, bought her sofa here. My fraternity little brother from Washington, Pennsylvania's father bought carpet here. Look at the distance between us. I went to stay with him once, and his father said, "Oh, you're from Barnesville." I said, "Yes." He says, "See what you're standing on?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "That came from Barnesville." Anyway, Kirk sold in 1974 and to May and Leopold, and the rest is history. Some other favorite businesses at the time: Herb Hall's, Harp's Restaurant, which is not long for the reality. Damsel Ice Cream, Damsel's Ice Cream, which there is Mansell Tykonsky, and it says here since 1855, and it used to say also home to 4,465 residents on the back. And Mance Bakery delivered bread all over the area. Well, anyway, enough of that. 1950. Not a lot of us were here. I had not yet started my work career at the campus shirt factory. This is Harps on the corner, and there's West Main Street. This was taken on Sunday afternoon. This photo from Jean's collection was taken earlier. And how that photo, one day on Facebook, it showed up, or not Facebook, but on eBay, it showed up. And I just about died and went to heaven. I immediately bought it. And come to find out that photo was taken by Carl Eichhorn. He was a graduate of 1943 of BHS. His family lived out on Olivet Road. He was a professional photographer his entire career. And he died in 2017 at the age of 93. Well, a photographer near his home in Cocoa Beach, Florida, bought all of his photos. And he discovered these snow photos, which he started printing. He had no idea. He knew that Carl was from Barnesville, and he thought this was in the late 40s. So he and I started corresponding back and forth because there's a whole collection, and I've suggested we do that as our calendar next year because it's 75 years. But anyway, Carl walked into town up Mulberry Street, went up to Main Street, down to the corner, up to Chestnut Street to this Ohio station, and went back to the depot and walked home. And but anyway, he and I corresponded back and forth, and I ended up being able to buy not only that photo, but a copy of all the other photos, and I now have all of the negatives as well. So that was wonderful, because look at that. Isn't that iconic? It's just phenomenal. Now, 1961, that's the end of the passenger era. These are students of only school teachers saying sayonara, so long, farewell, adios. There's the last train coming through. This was the last passenger train in July 1956, which was actually still steam. Up here in the corner, that's the last train coming through on June 30th, 1961. A lot of people got on the train and they rode from Barnesville to Bethesda and then had somebody come and pick them up. Why was that happening? Because Interstate 70 was being built. This is Henrysburg. There's the Henrysburg Methodist Church steeple, and that's what did the railroad in. The only thing that saved the Barnesville Depot was the fact that we had a work crew here, because all those other stations were torn down. So today you have Barnesville and Cambridge. They had work crews. So we're fortunate in that respect, and we were able to save it. Well, Barnesville, in the 1960s, before daylight savings time was required by law, Barnesville could set their own time. And Barnesville we're stubborn people, and we don't like change. So here's two articles out of the Wheeling paper. Well, the Enterprise in one, and here's the other one. Barnesville votes by 3-2 vote to decide against fast time. When I grew up, it was fast time, slow time, not daylight savings time versus. And here's a story, and this story from the Wheeling paper goes into which milk dealers liked to go on daylight savings time and which didn't. The folks at United Dairy liked daylight savings times, and the folks at the Barnesville Dairy down behind the garment factory liked the other. But anyway, this is a little postcard that I have in my collection that I threw in. It says, just a line to say hello. Our progress here is very slow. Greetings from Barnesville, Ohio. It wasn't until the federal law required us to do daylight savings time that we did. Because the problem was the bank was on daylight savings time. The railroad was on daylight savings time. The post office was on daylight savings time. The businesses were on standard time because the farmers wanted them to be on standard time. And that one year, the Barnesville School District in the conundrum decided to go on what I called halftime. So rather than starting at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, they started at 8:30 between the two. I thought that was pretty smart, though. All right, and then there were a lot of civic improvements in the 60s. You know, now we're embracing federal involvement, and this is Slow Creek Reservoir, which is 750 million gallons in a 93-acre lake, which now supplies water to four counties. The Barnesville-Hutton Memorial Library was dedicated in 1968 or 69, and I forget the exact year. The Barnesville Senior Center was started about that time, and this is the dedication in 1969 of the Belmont County Airport, which is Barnesville Bradfield Airport, and we were in contention with the folks in St. Clairsville for that distinction. And John Bradfield just said, "I'll give the town the airport," and he gave it to us. And there were a lot of good Republicans here then. And James Rhodes was governor, and he was a Republican. And anyway, and there's John Bradfield right there in the middle, and there's Joe, his son. So anyway, that's why the airport is here, and it's not somewhere else. The Belmont County Museum was started about this time as well, because Earl Watt that owned the house right there that took 5 or 6 years to build, 1890, finished in 1893, if I remember correctly. It was in disrepair, but it was a corner lot. So those lots were very much prized by gas companies to put gas stations in. And the neighbors said, oh, well, we don't want that to happen. So they bought the property, and that's what started the Belmont County Historical Society and the Mansion Museum. This is this here. Let me go back one. This is the dedication, all the trees. See the trees that were in the front yard then? And that's the president at the time, Vernon Burkhart, during the address that summer. And look what it is today. And Brock and several others who are here are very much involved in it. Beverly as well. And it's a blessing. And look what a resource it is. Then the Pumpkin Festival came along. Well, it started in the Catholic Church basement in 1964. In 1968, it moved on Main Street. In 1968, when it moved on Main Street, I rode in my granddad's car to the Coshocton County Fair and looked out the window. I had to go, nothing will ever happen to that. It really won't get big. Well, I was wrong. And here we are today, 59 years later. And it's known regionally. It's a draw for Barnesville. And it's also a draw for the downtown. And it says something about the community. State Theater, of course, was built, I didn't mention it earlier, in 1924, finished in 25, originally called the Modi State Theater. And of course, by the 1960s, Mr. Modi was having problems with children. He first said he was going to close the theater in 1959. He did for a short period of time. In 1961, he did for a short period of time, and then it was reopened, and then it closed, and then it reopened. It was only open in the winter months. But here's one of the closings here. And it says here, if you look at this, he says, it's with heavy heart we announce the permanent closing of the State Theater. Rising costs and the hopelessness of controlling the conduct of many of our school-age darlings. He fought the children. I went there once. They were rolling soda bottles down. He was yelling at them. So I had to do some research. I thought it closed in 1964, 65. This, my friends, is the flyer or the poster for the March 29th, 1969 final show at the State Theater. And it's a doozy. It's a spaghetti Western. He rides a horse with a queer name, and he carries a pink parasol. He's after a solid gold stagecoach and a band of cutthroats. It's the living and dying end in excitement. The Stranger Returns. That was the last movie here. So it really wasn't any Gone with the Wind or anything, but nonetheless, the good folks that are here working on the State Theater, they can start in the cellar and work their way up. Strip mining came along in the 1960s and 1970s and provided a lot of work for the men in the area. These were the giant earth moving machines that eventually were here. There's the Mountaineer, there's the Silver Spade, and the Gem of Egypt. And the Gem of Egypt, I remember going to that when it opened in 1967. This is a photograph here of the first load of coal leaving Egypt Valley in 1967 on the B&O. There was a spur that came in from Flushing. And of course, the rest of that is history as well. Then the railroad eventually left in 1983. This is what the railroad station looked like about that time. That's Ernie Howe's truck over there, that red pickup truck, if you knew Ernie Howe, who was on town council. The building was literally boarded up. We had to raise $125,000 to buy it, and then we were able to get a state grant to fix it up. But the idea was, we're not going to have coal mining anymore. We're not going to have this. Let's try tourism. And we tried it. And by the way, there's the town clock, which was sold out of the town, and then we brought it back. It was bought by the community and brought back. So it had some success. We had the Victorian Village project that I worked for. And then in 1991, there was a recession, and a lot of the older ladies that traveled on the bus tours quit coming. And so, we're still trying to figure all of that out. That's some of us cleaning the businesses downtown, and whoops. And that is me right there, Kelly Loudon and Frank Williams. And anyway, so the downtown is very important to us, but then it's a changing community. We're now near the turn of the 20th century, 1995. Watt Car and Wheel leaves. G.C. Murphy's pulls out in here in 1992. The Rose store closes. First National Bank sells to West Banco in Wheeling, and for a while it was called West Banco Barnesville. And then Lotus Glass closed in 1995. So the community was changing. But then there's a new century and new changes. Instead of the bank building sitting there empty like it did in a lot of communities, it's now the Ohio Hills Health Center because of the foresight of Thomas Shelley and a lot of the city leaders at the time. And there's now a dental place next door. WVU Medicine now manages Barnesville Hospital. We're very fortunate to still have it because a lot of rural hospitals have closed. The oil and gas shell came along, and then there's businesses downtown that have opened as well. We need to do more in that area, but that's something that's happened. In 2016, we put together a 48-page newspaper celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Barnesville Enterprise. And there's Gene Davies in the center with Catherine and Pam McCourt with the county commissioners getting a proclamation at the time. There's Gene and Pam and Connie down there, and there's Bill in the lower corner. Little did we know 2 years ago that Gatehouse Media would purchase Dix Communications, and within 2 years they would have totally destroyed the newspaper. We're going to see what we can do to bring that back in some other fashion, and I've been working on that for several months now. So if you are interested in talking with me about that, please do. Then, out of the blue comes the State Theater Group, and I thought, well, where did this come from? They know what they're doing, and they're going after some state grant money, and they know which strings to pull and which ones not to pull, and they're doing a great job. I would have never, ever in my life thought that there was a chance for that building to come back. But here are some of the schematics, and they're under review for a state grant at the present time, and they're going to make it happen. Things in Barnesville take time. When we went after the depot, that'll never happen. It did, and it's still there today. So, with all of that said, what's the crown jewel of Barnesville? Or some of us this past week would say, what was the crown jewel of Barnesville? Well, the crown jewel of Barnesville is not the Pumpkin Festival, it's not the hospital, it's not the Mansion Museum. It's really the downtown where all those parades and the Pumpkin Festival and all these events have taken place for years and years and years and years and years. And this is an aerial view of the street. Here are a couple Christmas views that were taken that I picked up recently. Here's what Luke Johnson has done with the old Moose building, which there were holes in the roof of the Moose building when Bill Knox told me when Luke took that building over. In a lot of cities, that would just simply have been torn down, but it wasn't here. And there's East Main Street Christmas a couple of years ago in front of the Enterprise building. And here's some photos of downtown that I took earlier this year, and I will note this building, these two buildings, these buildings here as well. This building was built by A.E. Kennard in 1913, one of the earliest purpose-built auto dealerships in all of Eastern Ohio, and a rare two-story building. This building here was Dr. D.O. Shepard, who wrote the history of Barnesville. That was his office and residence. And in 1923, that was the location of the Barnesville, first location of the Barnesville Public Library. Harp's Corner, what else can I say about that? I mean, everybody's heard of it. So now we're at a crossroads. And I refer to this as self-inflicted damage. There were buyers lined up that would buy these buildings, keep them on the tax records, put them back in use. And a majority of the village leaders decided otherwise. And in haste this last week, those 3 buildings were torn down. And the 2 buildings on the corner are slated to be torn down as well. So it's up to you who live here. It's up to those of us who love this place to decide what's the future going to be. Is it going to be this or this? If you ever do Google Maps, Google downtown Zanesville. I call that the Zanesville effect. There's maybe 3 buildings in an entire block. Once you start down this path, I can tell you where you're going to end up because I've worked in historic preservation and downtown development for almost 3 decades. So, but the damage is done. But the question is this the end of the damage? And only you folks are going to be able to decide that. And my hope and prayer is, as has normally been the case, Barnesville will prove itself worthy of the cause. So there it is. And that, again, is the downtown. I was going to play a song for you, but I know I've talked way too long. And I'm trying to figure out how long I have talked. Oh, I've talked almost an hour and a half. So sorry about that. But nonetheless, I was going to play the song. If you go home today or you're doing YouTube, do Petula Clark's Downtown, 1963. And that Barnesville still has the opportunity, and hopefully we can undo the damage that's been done. But in closing, I just want to say this, and this is what I said at the, Carter G. Woodson was an African-American historian who started, and when I first found out about the free African-Americans at Captina, he did a book in 1930 and it was called the Heads of Free African-American Households in the United States in 1830. Well, I went to the State Historical Society and found that. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven, because here was everybody who lived within just, a quarter of a mile where I started out in life. But he said, a people cannot know its future until it knows its past. And then recently in the Washington Post was Suzanne Lepere, who's an author of a book in Fairfax County. She's a librarian. She said, progress doesn't happen just because time passes. Progress happens when people take action to make things better. So I finish on that note. I thank you for coming. I thank you for being a wonderful audience and not throwing things at me or anything like that. And I hope you're able to go away this evening with a little better appreciation for Barnesville and for this wonderful, wonderful town. Thank you.